Okay guys, so this is the start of Unit 5. This unit is going to cover women's history, really sort of the first half of it. So we had 3 units where we covered African American history, and we're going to try to squeeze our ladies into 2 units. So things might feel like it's running really fast, and it's probably because it is. So this first unit on women is going to cover women from the colonial period during Jamestown and stuff I'll talk about now. And then the last little bit will be once women finally achieved suffrage in 1920. So women in the colonial era, it really just depended on where in the colonies you were, what it was like for women. Now, obviously, there were some overall patterns, but typically, as far as like specific laws and rights of women, it really just depended on the colony. Sort of how we saw in Black history when we were looking at slavery, how it was sort of different in every single colony that slaves existed. It's the same way for women. Women had different rights in every colony, but overall, we're going to be looking at just the British colonies. I'm not going to cover the Spanish or the French the way I did in Black history, just because we don't have all the time for that, and I want to just focus on American history, I guess, specifically. So as far, like I said, there are some overall patterns that we see among women. One is that typically women in the colonial period were with large families, farming families and stuff. We see this going all the way back to Jamestown. So if you remember, Jamestown was our first settlement in 1607 in Virginia. And the first woman to come to Jamestown was the wife of, and the maid, I guess, of a man who was already in Jamestown. But really the first group of women to come to Jamestown on their own came in I want to say maybe 1619, around then. It was maybe, 10 years or 15 years into the life of Jamestown. And when they came, they were actually brought as slaves. And so when they were brought to Jamestown, they were actually auctioned off. So this is similar to indentured servitude. There were about 90 of these women that had come from England to Jamestown solely for the purpose of being the wives of the men who were already in Jamestown. They were auctioned off, not for money, but for tobacco. And then the shipping company who brought these women over took the tobacco and then sold it, and that's how they made their profit. So the cost of the tobacco basically paid for a profit, as well as it paid for the woman's voyage over to Jamestown. So these women were called the tobacco brides, and they were, like I said, sort of like the first big group of women that we see all coming to the British colonies at once. Now, up in New England, things are a little bit different. We see in the New England colonies, which we know started with the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and women who came over on the Mayflower. Of that, there were several. Of the, over 100 pilgrims on the Mayflower, there were 18 women. Some of them were 18 married women. And then there were, in addition to that, maybe 10 or less unmarried women, and then some children. For the most part, that's why I said, there's so many of these married women. They're really just coming here because their husbands are coming here. It was not common. It was, extremely rare for a woman to say, I just want to leave Great Britain and move to the, British colonies and start my life on my own. That was really, not exactly accepted. Obviously, the companies and the British government wanted that to happen to a certain degree because they want to populate this new territory. But in reality, women who did that, it was, sort of risque and manly and not exactly something that people were going to glorify. But there were some women back in Great Britain who, maybe ran out of options, felt like they didn't have anything else. They were poor. They couldn't support themselves. They didn't have a husband. So they would decide to almost sign up to be like an indentured servant, but more like an indentured bride, and would come over, to the British colonies, basically in hope of finding a man. So there were women in all of our original colonies, and they were a very important part. Now, back in the 1600s, we're looking at extremely traditional roles of women for these colonial women. They were typically, the wife and mother first and foremost. There wasn't a lot of field and farm work done by women. Now, that doesn't mean to say it didn't happen. Obviously, especially in these early years, while things are just getting started and they're just building the colony, women were getting their hands dirty just the same as men. But once the colonies grew, that sort of fell back because there were a lot more men there to take the brunt of the work, like indentured servants and slaves were constantly being brought in. Women were really supposed to stay at home, right? It was the traditional roles of the woman in all of these colonies. We see women as the teacher and homemaker, molder of the children. And she's also, a spiritual leader for the children. However, women are not spiritual leaders really in the church. And that's something we especially see when we're looking at the Puritan community in the New England area, in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and in others. So if you remember, in my American History 1 class, we talked about a woman in the Puritan community in the 1630s named Anne Hutchinson. Anne Hutchinson was a midwife in Massachusetts Bay, fairly well known in the community, as was the rest of her family, because she was a midwife. You're helping everyone give birth to their baby, so you're almost like a doctor, one of the more well-known people in town. And in the Puritan community, in church especially, women and men had very different roles. Like I said, it was the very traditional idea. Women relied on the private sphere and men were in the public sphere. And especially in Massachusetts, where there's no separation of church and state, when that means men are in the public, that means men are in the government and men control the church. And that means men basically control every aspect of life. And this was something that was pushed forward by the founder of Massachusetts Bay, John Winthrop, who was also the governor of Massachusetts and was the reverend and sort of like the head of the church at the time. Now, Anne Hutchinson did not fall into this category of staying in the private sphere. She ended up getting in trouble because she held Bible studies in her home. Originally, she would bring women to her home and they would talk about that week's sermon, and they would, dig into the word a little bit deeper, but slowly but surely some of these women were like telling their husbands, I really like what Anne had to say. You should come to Bible study. So men started to come to the Bible study. This is a problem for two reasons. Reason number one, men and women didn't really worship together. In the church, women and men actually sat in two different places. Men sat in the front and women sat in the back. They were separated even sometimes by like a low barrier, like a small wall between the two, because women could be seen as a distraction for men during church. The other reason is that women were absolutely not allowed to teach the Bible, interpret the Bible on their own, preach, none of that. That was definitely not something that women were allowed to do. So Anne Hutchinson was actually arrested and put on trial in 1637. They charged her with violating the commandment to honor thy mother and father. Actually, they said she brought disrespect on herself, her family, and the church, and they said that she also, had accused the reverends of preaching the wrong stuff, and it was just a whole laundry list of things. And in reality, her trial was a sham. They had already decided they were going to get rid of her before she even showed up to try to defend herself. But she was a smart lady, and she definitely gave them a run for their money. But in the end, she was found guilty and banished. She ended up moving to New York, where her and her entire family were killed by Indians. Only one of her daughters managed to live, and she actually does have descendants alive to this day. But Anne was not the only woman who sort of pushed back against the ideas of what women were allowed to do in the Puritan communities, especially in Massachusetts. There was another woman, a Quaker actually. Her name was Mary Dyer, Dyer, and she was also banished for trying to push for religious tolerance in the Puritan community. She had said that she thought that the Puritans should allow Quakers because she was a Quaker. She had actually been one of the people going to Anne Hutchinson's Bible studies. And she said we should allow religious tolerance, and they banished her, but she actually came back and kept pushing for religious tolerance, so they finally executed her. So these women were facing, a lot of, it was definitely an uphill battle for these women in their religious lives. And we see slowly but surely in the Massachusetts community, when there is problems, women are going to get the brunt of that. Not having that separation of church and state, women not having any power in their church, not having any power in their government, gives them no ability to defend themselves. So when we see the Salem witch trials take place in the 1690s, and we've got, dozens and dozens and dozens of women being accused of witchcraft with little to no evidence, there is no way for them to be able to truly defend themselves. So when we see the Salem witch trials take place in Massachusetts, it actually spreads. It wasn't just in Salem. There were multiple cities in Massachusetts that saw witch trials. Hundreds collectively in the United States, hundreds of people had been accused of being witches. Back in Great Britain, hundreds of people had been executed for being witches. It wasn't until, mid-1690s that the Massachusetts government officially ended all of these investigations and called it all off, because they realized that they were wrong and that none of these women were actually probably witches. And now, yes, there were some men who had been accused during the Salem witch trials, but they were pretty much just accused if their wife had been accused and he had stuck up for her. That was basically the only reason why men had really been accused. So the 6 men in Massachusetts who were executed during the Salem witch trials, that was pretty much their story. Now we see things finally start to change for women when we get to the First Great Awakening in the 1730s and 1740s. So the First Great Awakening was like the first big religious revival. Obviously, everyone in the colonies at that point pretty much was Christian, and it wasn't like people were getting away from the church. It's just that at the same time, Europe was just coming out of the Age of Enlightenment, where lots of emphasis had been put on science and logic and reason, and how government should come from these things. And there's been this, long, thousands of years, we've always had this conception in our minds that church and science, that religion and science have to be at odds with each other. So when science started to see this big sort of moment in the early 1700s, the church thought, we need to have a moment too, because we don't want people to forget about their relationship with God. So we see a major religious revival in the British colonies at that time, and that's called the First Great Awakening. So if you've never been to a revival before, there are, multiple preachers who preach at different locations. There were primarily 2 preachers at that time, George Whitefield and Jonathan Edwards, who were like celebrities in the colonies. George Whitefield had crowds of like 30,000 who would come hear him speak, and he went on this massive tour all the way from Georgia, up to the most northern parts of the colonies, and would give these massive sermons. And one thing he really talked about, one thing that the First Great Awakening really put emphasis on, was your own self, introspection into your own religious life, and, interpreting the Bible for yourself and reading the Bible for yourself. And that's something very different from what we saw happening in the Puritan community before, where for women it was about just listen to what men tell you is in the Bible, and what men tell you should think about the Bible, and go with that. Now they're saying, no, read it for yourself. Have your own evidence as to why this is what you believe. Have your own relationship with God. Don't let somebody else tell you what that should be like. So we start to see women taking a lot more agency in their own Christian life and in their own religious life after the First Great Awakening, which is pretty cool. Now, getting into the American Revolution, women also played a very large role. I'm not going to go through all of the causes of the American Revolution and stuff. This is largely stuff that we already know, and some stuff that we've already talked about. The Stamp Act and the coercive laws and stuff. I'm not going to get into that, but I do want to touch on women's involvement in each of those moments. especially in the years leading up to the American Revolution, women played a significant role in one group in particular, and that would be the Daughters of Liberty. So even women who weren't in the Daughters of Liberty in Boston participated in groups like this and did things like this, but the Daughters of Liberty are really the best example. Women were really in a lot of cases, the voice of the revolution for each other, in terms of, there were plenty of men in big cities like New York and Boston and Philadelphia who were all communicating with each other back and forth, writing letters, all of our founding fathers talking about what's been going on. But women were doing the exact same thing in books, newspapers, almanacs. Women were constantly writing about the role of government and the tyranny of the British crown and all sorts of stuff like this. And when all of these taxes started to be levied by the British government, women were among the first to push for a boycott. The Daughters of Liberty, different from their sort of brother group, the Sons of Liberty. The Sons of Liberty would almost like violently force people to participate in boycotts and of British goods, and if they couldn't, they would lash out. They were, in some people's eyes, terrorists. But the Daughters of Liberty were not like that. The Daughters of Liberty were more about, like, let me help. If you can't, if you have to buy your textiles from Great Britain because that's how you run your business, maybe we can find out how to make your textiles here, and have sewing circles of women who would sew for you so that you don't have to buy your products from Great Britain. Or if you're a baker and you have to buy sugar or molasses from Great Britain, maybe let's find recipes that you can make that use sugar substitutes so that you don't have to participate in buying British products, so that you can stand for the revolution and boycott any British goods. So women were really instrumental in that, and honestly, in a massive way, that got even more people on board than just a lot of the fear that the Sons of Liberty had been projecting. Now, during the American Revolution, during the war itself, women didn't, just stop participating. Even though women weren't allowed to serve in the military then, we still see plenty of women doing it anyway. And the most famous case was a woman named Deborah Sampson. Deborah Sampson is one of the, she's the only one we know of, that we know the name of from the American Revolution, but we know that it happened. In 1782, she actually disguised herself as a man and joined the 4th Massachusetts Regiment. And sort of like that in Mulan, if you've seen Mulan, the way she was discovered is because she was actually injured. And when they went to treat her for her injuries, they realized that she had lady parts and not man parts. So they gave her an honorable discharge and sent her home. And years later, actually, when Thomas Jefferson was president, the federal government formally recognized her service, thanked her for her service, and she was awarded a Medal of Honor, which is pretty cool. But like I said, she's just that one woman. There were dozens of cases of this. Women were taking care of everything at home while men were fighting the revolution. And that's not any less important than actually putting your life on the line. If you fight in battle and you win it and you come home and there's nothing to come home to, like your business has fallen apart or your farm isn't functioning anymore and you have no way to make money and continue to live your life, then what was the point of the revolution? So having women at home to sort of carry things on was still a huge, huge part of this. Other women that were very outspoken for the revolution, one woman named Phyllis Wheatley. She was actually a former slave. She's the first African-American woman to ever have her writing published in the United States, I'm pretty sure. And she was a poet, and she wrote tons of things about fighting off tyranny and pushing for revolution and freedom for all people. And she had several poems where she even sort of highlighted the irony of now we're pushing off our oppressors and we're getting rid of tyranny, but there are still, a million people living like that in the United States at that time under slavery. Other women, our founding fathers, their wives were very involved. Martha Washington sponsored tons of social events in the Capitol to try to raise money and raise support for the federal government at the time that we know was struggling financially. Abigail Adams, John Adams' wife, same way. She constantly wrote to her husband pushing for him to try to include women in the Declaration of Independence, include women in the Constitution when it's written. Don't forget her very famous line, "Remember the ladies." And if you remember back when we were talking about the Constitution and Declaration of Independence, we read that letter from her where she was really saying, if you're not careful, women could have their own revolution in the United States. And he sort of laughed that off. But now historians are saying, like, women weren't included then, and today in 2018 we're starting to see some of that, a little bit of that revolution starting to take place. Now, having so many women involved in the American Revolution led to a sort of new moment and new ideas about what a woman's role is in society. And that new idea is called Republican motherhood. Republican motherhood is centered on the belief that the patriots' daughters should be raised to instill the ideas of republicanism and that they should pass it on to the next generation. So this is a little confusing because it's almost like women's empowerment, but also without women's empowerment. The way that this is women's empowerment is because we're saying how and why women are important to the creation of future ideals, to furthering our values as a country, and to raising the next generation. And in reality, in the 1700s, that was all on them. Women are every single job, every person in a child's life, a woman is pretty much doing that in the 1700s. She's the teacher, the homemaker, the mother, everything all wrapped into one. And so Republican motherhood is validating that and saying, if we're going to have strong leaders in the future, and if we're going to have people who take care of this country that we've just built and who value republicanism, the idea that it's the people's voice who should matter, and it should be the government's job to protect the people and represent what they want. It's a woman's job to continue to push that narrative, and it's a woman's job to educate her children that should take place. Now, this is where it is not women's empowerment. Because who is she educating? She's educating her children, and her children are going to be getting two very different educations. Her sons are going to be getting how government works and how the economy works and how it's important for the masses to be represented in their government. All these ideas about republicanism and liberalism, because they want their sons to be the next George Washington, the next Thomas Jefferson. But our daughters are getting an education to tell them, here's what you need to tell your sons one day. And it's sort of, we're revolving a woman's entire identity and her entire role in our country as a whole. It's somewhat revolving around men. So there were plenty of women at the time who really supported this idea and said that it was a huge moment for women, and that it was sort of almost like the first moment of feminism. But there were still plenty of women as well who said, no, this is not really real. This is almost sexism in the same way. There had been plenty of women at the time who said, this isn't enough. We need to see women move further on and past this, and we need to give women a voice in the government. But, for the most part, our founding fathers were not really for that. You've read before how Thomas Jefferson felt about women in the government. He did not support it, and that's pretty much how most founding fathers felt. So women aren't really going to be getting much of a voice until really we get into like the early 1900s. For like the next 100 years, women don't have much say in what's happening in our government.